Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Greetings and welcome again to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. Thanks for meeting me here at the intersection of politics and culture again. It's been a while. First, my producer took a couple of weeks off for a well-earned vacation. Then I had to postpone this episode for a week for scheduling reasons. But now we're back on track, so thanks for not giving up on me. I have a very interesting guest today. Well, actually, all my guests so far have been very interesting. I'm really blessed and grateful to have had just an amazing string of fascinating, accomplished writers and scholars and thinkers, and today's guest is no exception. I've been a longtime fan of his podcast, Young Heretics, and now he has a brand new book out that I just finished, and so I'm eager to get to him. But first, I'm going to do a little shameless self-promotion about my Substack account. As you may or may not know, Substack is an online publishing platform for writers and thinkers to connect more directly with the people who are interested in what they have to say. It's a bit like a blog, and writers can send digital newsletters directly to their subscribers. I was a little slow to check it out and get started, but a couple of months ago, I decided to launch my own called Culture Warrior. The actual address is marktapson.substack.com, but you can go to substack.com and just search for Culture Warrior, 2 words, and there you'll find me. I do already have a website at www.marktapson.com, where one can go to get my full bio, a backlog of my articles, and links to my author pages online, but I didn't do much there besides collect and post my articles. I'm much more active now at my Substack. My mission at Culture Warrior is much the same as what I do here, which is playing my small role in the culture war and doing what I can to help bring awareness about what's going on in the culture. The mission is to do what I can to defend and preserve the endangered legacy of Western civilization. And that sounds rather grandiose, I know, but hey, the alternative is to surrender, right? I know that you care about doing your part too, or you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. So I'll be posting all my forthcoming articles there at my Substack that I might publish elsewhere. I'll be posting each episode of the Right Take podcast as it appears, and I'll also be writing original content that is exclusive to the site. My latest article posted at my Substack, for example, was about the controversy over the woke revision of books by beloved children's author Roald Dahl. Although by the time you hear this podcast, I'll have a couple more pieces up. I may also be doing some vlogging on the site, some video blogging, especially for my upcoming trip to the Holy Land. So I invite you to check it out, and if you like what you see, please subscribe, which you can do for free. Many writers have paid subscriptions to their Substack accounts, but mine is free for now, although I am considering offering a paid option as well with premium content. And if I do that, I'll also try to figure out how to grandfather in, as they say, my earliest subscribers so that they can continue to receive that content for free as well. Anyway, that'll be the best way to keep up with my writing and podcasting and speaking and my observations on the culture, on history and current events, and to get exclusive access to the weekly email newsletter, which contains not only links to my posts for the week, but also article recommendations from the best I have found on the internet for the week. It will also include book and maybe even entertainment recommendations, links to episodes of the Right Take podcast, as I mentioned, and I'm also toying with other ideas about how to kind of spice up the site. And I'm hoping it can be a place to create a community of like-minded readers. Substack is really good for that, who care about our culture, who are deeply concerned that we're in a time of civilizational decadence and decline, and who want to do something about it. People who want to become more familiar with the cultural currents and ideas and people that are shaping the world we live in and that we are leaving to our children. So I'd like to welcome you there. Once again, the address is marktapson.substack.com, or go to substack.com and search for Culture Warrior, as I said, and find me that way. You'll see the avatar, the image that's associated with my Substack. It's a flag with a red cross on a black and white field. You might even recognize the flag. It's called the Beauséant, the battle flag flown by the warrior monks of the medieval Knights Templar. The cross of the flag, of course, represents Christ and his sacrifice. The black and white background symbolizes the duality of evil and good. The black is on top because evil often seems to be winning in this world, but underneath the good is always there and will ultimately prevail. So join me there, and let's save Western civilization. And that, not so coincidentally, leads me to my guest today, Spencer Klavan, whose new book is literally about saving the West. So we're going to talk about that. He's a very smart, very interesting culture warrior. So please stay with us and don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take to make sure you don't miss any of the great conversations like the one we're about to have here at the intersection of politics and culture. And please leave a review if you like what you hear. Don't touch that dial. My guest today at the Right Take podcast is a scholar and a gentleman, I presume, a writer and a podcaster with a lifelong devotion to the great works and principles of Western civilization. He's studied Greek and Latin at Yale. Then he spent 5 years at Oxford earning a doctorate in ancient Greek literature. He's an editor at the Claremont Institute and has written for the Claremont Review of Books and many other outlets, including The Atlantic, City Journal, The Daily Wire. He's also the podcaster at Young Heretics and happens to be the son of a friend of mine, Andrew Klavan, who has done an episode of The Right Take himself. Spencer Klavan, welcome to The Right Take podcast.
Oh, Mark, thanks very much for having me. Although now that you called me a gentleman, I feel that I'm going to have to live up to that. I don't know if I'm capable of it, but it's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you. You have a brand new book out, which can be found wherever fine books are sold, called How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Now, this book is right up my alley, reversing the decline of Western civilization, reclaiming its former glory, preserving and passing down the West's incredible cultural legacy to the next generation, looking to past wisdom for answers in the present. All that stuff really resonates with me, but I was beginning to think I was in a small minority in that respect. But the book seems to be selling like hotcakes, and you're getting a lot of media attention. Have you been pleasantly surprised that a book that's so steeped in classical learning, a book that says, let's look to Plato and Aquinas and Dante for insights into our current affairs, that seems to be striking such a chord with so many people. Have you been surprised about that?
Well, thanks. And yeah, I have the word, which is, I hate to use this word because I always find it a little bit disingenuous when I hear other people use it, but there truly is no other word for it than humbled. I feel humbled by this response because, yeah, like you, I think of us as kind of we happy few, we band of brothers who are in on this secret, right? That the great texts are not a kind of chore. They're not some kind of power structure or imposition of evil. They're not artificial or obscure. They're the world's greatest secret society. They're the deepest camaraderie that the mind is capable of finding, and it always feels a little bit like you're climbing uphill when you go into the public view and you say that, because what are you competing with? You're competing with the latest crisis in Congress, and you're competing with people's just personal preoccupations about Kim Kardashian and whatever. And I think that even though I believe, as you do, with great passion, that these are texts which can speak to everybody, which are urgent for our times, particularly that the Western canon is, more important and not less in the digital age. I believe all of those things in my head and in my heart. But I think that just you kind of take it for granted that you're going to be fighting a difficult battle to make that known. But actually, what has happened with this book, and in general, what I have discovered again and again, is that, in fact, people are so hungry for something rich and substantive. And if you can talk to people, from a place of fellowship, there's a wonderful quote in the letters of Seneca in which, this is a great Roman philosopher. He describes himself as a man in a hospital bed speaking into the next bed over. So in some sense, we're all fellow patients suffering from the same disease for which there is no cure, and that is like human brokenness, I guess. Um, and I think that's the perfect description of the right way to talk to people about this stuff. And when you do, you discover starvation, just starvation for substance and for connection to the past. And this stuff, it turns out, like, I'm not just saying it, like, this stuff really can help people find a little bit of peace, a little bit of clarity, and a little bit of guidance. So, I've been overwhelmed, delighted with the response to the book, and just in general kind of have had my faith in this stuff restored by my readers, which is always, that you try to bring something to the table. You, as an author, you try to give something to people. But what you discover is that readers and audience members always give back more than you could ever give. They are their own gift.
And that's what you had tried to accomplish also through your podcast, Young Heretics, right? Which is one of the very few podcasts that I have bookmarked. For those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about Young Heretics and the kinds of topics that you cover there and talk about?
Absolutely. And I should say that my first experience discovering that people could be reached, that people did care and would love to hear about this stuff, was through Young Heretics. And I'm very grateful and touched that you listen. I mean, it's funny, actually, the genesis of the show, because it speaks to this issue that we're talking about. When you have a public presence of any kind, when you start, I was writing essays mainly, kind of right out of grad school. And when you do that, you very quickly hear people say, "Oh, you should have a podcast." It's kind of like the new version of, you should have a newsletter or a blog, or you should write a book. It's like, "Oh, you should have a podcast." And so I did start hearing that a lot, and I am, as we've just discussed, I'm a classicist. That's kind of my passion. I studied ancient Greek literature in grad school. And that's really what I'm always digging my nose into, always trying to dredge something up from that period and that literature that can help. And so I would, people kept saying like, "Oh, you should have a podcast." And I kept saying, I'm not so sure that's actually true. Like, I sort of feel like, I'm an essayist. That's where my work is gaining traction, and I've only just begun to try to get good at that. And isn't this whole podcasting idea, that's just sort of what the hot thing is, and so why would I have a podcast? I'm not that personable, actually, was like another thing that I thought. And so finally, I got kind of worn down by my friends at Ricochet, who said, like, "No, this would be really, really cool." And they actually proposed the title Young Heretics, which I thought was great. And I said, "Okay, if I'm going to do a podcast, there's no point in me doing a podcast unless I'm just going to do like what my nerdy interests. Like, that's kind of, to me, the great benefit and joy of the medium, is that it just enables, like, nobody's really editing you, which is always a plus. And so there's nobody sort of sitting on the other end thinking, well, what is the public going to want, right? And that enables you to try out a little bit more of what Steve Jobs kind of referred to as telling people what they want. Like, yeah, there's not an existing market for this. I'm going to make one. I'm going to kind of offer you something that you didn't know you were missing. And that's why the show eventually became, the tagline was eventually the classical education that you didn't know you'd been denied or that you were missing. And so I was pretty stubborn about just, that I'm going to do stuff that maybe won't play super well, that isn't connected directly to the news, that doesn't react immediately to every controversy, but actually sits down with people and says, "Okay, we're having this big culture war. Everybody's head up about, is Homer racist, or must we defend Homer?" And we have these arguments over defending the classics. And what that means is that we rarely actually sit down and crack the classics open. Like, we don't spend time luxuriating in the riches of this canon, of the Western canon. And so that's what the show was designed to do. And once again, like, my own kind of pessimism was proven wrong very quickly. And in fact, the first note that we got on the opening episode, which was about 30 minutes long, and which I had tailored to be short because I thought, well, attention spans in the digital age, they're not that long. The first note that I got was, "Oh, just talk more, like ramble about this stuff, sort of, sit with us." And that's another beauty of the podcasting medium, is like people listen to Joe Rogan for 3 hours at a stretch. And why? Because he's sort of just engaged and you're just hanging out. It's very intimate kind of engagement. And so that was what I found with the Young Heretics audience, was like, you'd get messages. I'm listening to you talk about Aristotle on my tractor. I'm not like, I always use that example because it sounds like I'm making it up, but I'm not making it up. And it would be like, I'm a homeschool mom and you're helping me think through what to teach my kids. I'm a cop and I listen to you on the beat, like all of this stuff that really did actually kind of confirm that this was something people wanted, and not just something that I was doing as a kind of passion project, even though that is sort of how it began. So the great thing about How to Save the West, about this book for me, has been that it really is kind of Young Heretics, the book. Like if you liked the show and if you were interested in the kinds of insights that I was trying to bring to your world in that podcast, I think you'll really love this book. It's kind of a distillation of what I found most ennobling and enriching for my own self in doing that show, but also what I noticed people were responding to most, some of the issues and topics that I thought people seemed to feel most passionately about, and some of the ancient ideas that maybe were most in the vein of, I hadn't thought about it that way before. Like this classical text gives me a route to thinking about this that kind of cuts through a lot of our political BS, or just opens up a new avenue of thinking for me. And my favorite reaction, honestly, to a podcast episode or to this book is always like, I feel better now. And so this is kind of the book is kind of offering people the fruits of that process.
Yeah, I think one thing that makes the Young Heretics so listenable is that it could be, the topics you're covering could be very intimidating or even boring to some people, but you wear your education lightly, and your passion really comes through, and you make it listenable and interesting for people who might otherwise be turned off about a discussion about ancient Greek drama.
Well, thanks. Yeah. My hero, my intellectual role model is C.S. Lewis, and I talk about this on the show all the time. And I think it's kind of apparent just from the way that I focus on his works, and it's always his quotes that kind of come to the tip of my tongue when I'm just speaking off the cuff. And I think that the reason for this is that Lewis often says, I make no claim to original insights, which I think he's being a little, he's selling himself pretty short there, but he's making a fair point that anybody discovers who, reads deeply, is that everything you could think of has pretty much been said before, has been found in some capacity or another. But the gift, the blessing that you can give to people consists in saying it in a way that like hits them in the heart or in the gut. And Lewis has this fantastic gift for that. He is the lucidity of his prose, the clarity, the way he talks, just absolutely bowls me over, in part because as somebody who shares with him a love of classical literature, I can always see that under the surface, the smooth surface of his prose, there's like a whole iceberg's worth of maybe difficult or intimidating reading. There's Thomas Aquinas, there's Aristotle, there's, the four cardinal virtues. And in academic circles or in just, sort of literary world, that kind of gift can be really maligned or really dismissed. Simplicity of prose can be confused with oversimplification, or just with, simplicity, simple-mindedness, which is even worse. And there are versions of this that are true. Like sometimes somebody is just oversimplifying and it's not very helpful. But I really believe that clear writing is clear thought, and that there's a certain kind of simplicity that is the height of profundity, that has drilled the insight down into the most kind of straightforward distillation of itself. And so that's kind of always been my aim. And I think that the classical texts are important to do this with, because they they suffer from a lot of sort of obscurantism and distance from us. First of all, they're written in languages that we don't natively speak, that nobody natively speaks anymore. So they take some doing in that capacity. I'm really passionate about translation. I do a lot of my own translation for this reason, to bridge that gap. But then also they are, kind of lorded over by a certain academic elite who, you know, sometimes are in it to really teach and to make people, to enlighten people, but sometimes are in it just to kind of keep this stuff behind bars, to make it seem more imposing so that they seem cooler because they can understand it. And that makes people feel like this is just something that, these books were basically written by PhDs for PhDs to furnish material for theses. And this is what my just childhood and background taught me was simply not true. Growing up in this house full of books, and knowing that I was actually therefore in a room full of friends, I've just always felt really passionately that you can and should distill most of this stuff, or at least communicate most of this stuff in a way that feels urgent for people, even if it is complicated. Sometimes it's complicated. Some things in life are complicated, so they take a lot of talking about. But the actual insights in, let's say, Greek tragedy, right? You should always, I feel, be talking about something like Greek tragedy with an awareness that the reason this thing is still in your hands, this little book is still in your hands, despite the fire at Alexandria and the, just vicissitudes, the accidents of medieval copyists and all that stuff. The reason this little book is in your hands is because once upon a time, somebody sat down in the theater at Dionysus and this thing set their hair on fire. Like, this was so urgent. And it still is. It's just that, you kind of have to clear away a little bit of the smoke of the ages. I think like there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of just talking in general that does the opposite of that isn't really aiming at that. And I feel like it's not worth doing unless you're making it alive again.
Let's talk for a second about Western civilization, the state of Western civilization, or at least the attitude toward Western civilization. One of the attitudes that's prevalent among young people today about the West is that it is the fount of all historical evil. We kind of live in this multicultural intellectual mode now where all cultures have their own validity and truths, except for the West, which is, the Doctor Evil.
The only one that's forbidden to celebrate.
Exactly. It's one long narrative of oppression and exploitation of other cultures and racism. We live in a time in which the West is being conflated with this deplorable condition called whiteness. Is Western civilization in its essence white or in any way related to skin color?
Oh boy. Well, whiteness, right? I mean, first of all, there's kind of two things to say about that, right? One is that there's nothing wrong with being born white. There's also nothing wrong with being born black. There's nothing wrong with being born any color that God made you. And so the whole notion that if the West is associated with whiteness as a kind of evil, then like the notion that means the West itself is inherently flawed and evil, that's one I reject. But I also reject the concept of the West as white. I think that's like a historically illiterate view that can only be sustained by people who have been trained not to look at the tradition that they are maligning. And this is how this works. I talk about this in the introduction to the book. It is a vicious circle designed to keep you from finding out that you're being had. They tell you, first of all, that like the founders held slaves, let's say, or some terrible thing that Aristotle said about women. And therefore, these guys are sub-virtuous. They fall beneath the exacting standards of our pristine modern sensibilities. And they're worth nothing. In fact, they are worth less than nothing. They're dangerous. And they're white, which is really what when people talk about whiteness, they're certainly scapegoating a particular race, but they're also, as scapegoating always does, they're associating that race with a whole, like every human evil, and they're basically identifying a truth, which is that the human race is broken, and then in order to avoid having to encounter that brokenness within themselves, they're layering that brokenness, loading it onto the back of some race. And it doesn't matter what race it is. Like, this is, people think that there's no such thing as reverse racism, or maligning white people is somehow more virtuous than maligning black people. It's like it all goes in the same bucket. It could be white people, it could be black people, it could be Jews. Like, it has been all of these groups throughout history that have been the brunt of this, because humanity is extremely averse to looking inward, to observing the mote in its own eye. And we all have this impulse, and it plays out in these really nasty ways. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, the West is not, in fact, restricted as a concept to any one geographical region or any one nation or people. I mean, when I talk about the West, what I mean is the cultural and intellectual inheritance of Athens and Jerusalem. And these are two pillars. Yeah, right. Two pillars of civilization. By Athens, Athens stands in for this compendium, the collection of wisdom and insight that we get from the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, and what kind of follows on after that, from Socrates on to Plato and Aristotle, the Hellenistic schools, and so forth. When I talk about Jerusalem, that's a stand-in for the scripture, the monotheism, and the wisdom literature of Judaism and Christianity. And already we are talking about brown people, we're talking about, I guess, white people, although whiteness is not really a concept that obtains in antiquity. So what do we even mean? Like, we're talking about people from all sorts of places, all sorts of times. We're talking about, in fact, ironically, the only kind of thing which can unify people across tribes, across nations, and that is ideals, right? That is principles and eternal truths. So what this boils down to in the end is that if we're concerned about racial tribalism, if we're concerned about tribalism of all kinds, dividing people against one another, the West is the answer. It's the antidote. And this is seen in the fact that the people who most malign the West as the kind of, racist boogeyman or whatever, have absolutely nothing to replace it with except old-fashioned pagan tribalism, except just this kind of, primitive reversion to, white people are inherently racist, men are inherently sexist, this group is kind of like, racism is in the DNA of this group, but not that group. And this, to me, is like, not only is it garbage, it's also just a supreme display of arrogance, because in the end, right, and this is the last great joke, who taught you to condemn the founders for holding slaves? And on what grounds do you condemn them? Well, if we think about it, it's on the grounds that all men are created equal. They were endowed by their creator with certain rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And where do you get that idea? You get it from the founders, who chiseled it right out of this tradition. This is not something that just falls out of the sky. These ideas don't just occur to people because we're all so enlightened in the 21st century. It's 2023, and now we're all so nice that we just believe in human equality. Like, in fact, it turns out we don't automatically believe in that. And if you survey history, you'll find that most people at most times and places have not believed in human equality. So we're in this kind of precious position of inheriting these ideas that have been wrought and fought over, and people had to die for them. And now, like, because they didn't fall ready-made into the world, because the people that put them forward fell short of them, as you fall short of them, as I fall short of them, as the people making these accusations certainly fall short of them. Like, because of that, we're supposed to give up on this tradition. Like, we're supposed to throw it out and just rely on our own resources. And I'm sorry, but I don't trust very much in my own resources. And I certainly don't trust in the resources of, like, our modern gurus who never read anything that was written more than 5 minutes ago. And I just find this this is obviously, as you can tell, like a topic of enormous passion to me, because it's so wrongheaded as to be almost evil, as to be designed to keep people from their inheritance. Yeah, I mean, this sort of thing, obviously, you can tell it's a subject of great passion for me, because I just find it so wrongheaded as to be actually evil, to keep people from their intellectual inheritance, to cut them off from the past, to deprive them of the best that the tradition has to offer when it comes to, figuring out how to be human in this world. It's not easy, and people are hurting, and they need guidance. And to tell them that for wanting guidance, or for looking to the past for guidance, they're somehow evil, they're somehow implicated in like the sin of the world, uniquely bad, uniquely racist, whatever. This to me is just, it's a tremendous disservice to people.
Let's talk about the book more specifically. Its premise, How to Save the West, its premise is that our culture is in a state of crisis, which I think we can all pretty much agree with. But the thrust of your book is that every crisis, well, in fact, let me just quote you here. The problems and conflicts which make the news are outward signs of deeper, more awful crises churning under the surface. These crises raise ancient questions about who we are and what the universe is, unquote. That's a great line there. So you're saying what we must do is look to the past for solutions, but let me pose something here, a problem to you. American culture today is really pop culture, which is kind of grounded in rooted in the now, the new, the what's next, and the kind of high culture that what used to be called high culture that you're so well educated in. It's a complete blank for most young people. So what would you say to younger generations who don't believe that all the, quote, dead white males, unquote, that you write about have anything of value and relevance to say to them?
Well, I would first ask a question that I raise in the book, which is, how's that working out for you? How do you feel about your no, I mean, honestly, like, how do you feel? And I'm genuinely curious with people when they come at me this way, as they often do. How do you feel when you wake up in the morning? And the next thing, I think, is to start to meet people where they are. So there's obviously something unsatisfying about the kind of culture you just described, the culture where everything that happened 5 minutes ago, and the only art is like the latest spin-off of whatever. Take your pick, the latest spin-off of the Kardashians or Lord of the Rings or what have you. There's something unsatisfying about that. I think people feel it, and I think if you approach them in serious openness about their unhappiness, they will admit it in conversation. The next thing is to meet people where they are, and that is by not dismissing or disregarding or hating on the stuff that they love. And I can be guilty of this sometimes. I think conservatives generally have this sort of knee-jerk tendency. They have this tick where somebody says this new thing, I'm really into this new thing, and I think it's the greatest thing ever. And our response is usually, that's not great at all. Like, Aristotle is great. And we're partly right about that. Aristotle is probably better than whatever this big new thing is. But there's something in the big new thing. And we really could do with more attention to what this thing is. So one area where this is really true for me, and where I have been an advocate and come under some fire, is video games, right? I mean, it's a very easy conservative hot take to say that video games are the death of society. Men trap themselves in their basement and they waste hour upon hour playing Grand Theft Auto and so forth. And I am a lover of video games. My dad and I played video games growing up. I think they contain some of our culture's best visual art, for one thing, if nothing else. And so my typical approach to this stuff is to say, people are obviously responding to something here. What are they responding to? And is there something in it that kind of digs deeper into the meat of human existence than just mere entertainment? So, for instance, the guy that's sitting in his basement playing Grand Theft Auto for hours and hours at a stretch, I agree, that's very unhealthy. You probably shouldn't be doing that. Why shouldn't you be doing that? Well, who has an answer to that question actually is Plato, who has this infamous moment in the Republic where he, through Socrates, exiles the poets, which is to say the tragedians, primarily, first and foremost, from the Callipolis, from the ideal state. And you say, why does he do that? Well, it's not because he thinks that art isn't beautiful or doesn't attract us. It's because he thinks it's so intensely beautiful and attractive that only philosophers should be allowed to handle it. Basically, he doesn't actually want to outlaw art. He wants to seize the artistic means of production, and he's being a little ironic about this, but to force the point, he's basically saying this stuff is weapons grade emotion. This is a direct, unmediated contact with your fellow man through this process that the Greeks called mimesis, representation or imitation. And if you approach that with no moral framework, and if you just give yourself over to it, if you do what Socrates calls funneling songs into your soul through your ears, right? Then yeah, it's going to be incredibly destructive. But things that have that kind of destructive power have it because there's something good about them that's being perverted or misused or mishandled. And so for conservatives and for like basement dwellers, the answer is the same, which is what is actually good here, and what is the framework within which this goodness can like find its best expression. And it's probably not like going to the theater for hours on end. It's probably not playing Grand Theft Auto interminably. It's probably, a moderated engagement with this stuff that acknowledges that seeks the good of it. Because the truth of the matter is we're not actually going to reinstate a culture in which everything looks the way it supposedly did during, I don't know, pick your favorite object of nostalgia, like the golden age of movies or the comic books of the 1950s or whatever. We're not going to recreate that because history changes the aesthetics of things, and things, do change day by day. And our task is always to re-embody the eternal principles in the here and now, in the new moment of what we're suffering through, which is digital culture. So I would say, like, yeah, there is something really lacking from our culture, but we're never going to fix it if we respond by simply rejecting all that is new out of hand. What we have to do is like meet people where they are and find a way through that into the depth of the tradition.
You identify 5 crises in the book, 5 what you call essential crises that we are facing now that we have faced before in history. And one of the crises you write about is the crisis of religion. Why is Christianity, which has historically been the faith of the West, Western civilization actually used to be known as Christendom, why is Christianity in such steep decline all over the Western world? It's booming in places like Central Africa or even China. But in the West, it's collapsing. Why is that? And related questions, is Christianity, this synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem that you mentioned, is that central and necessary for Western civilization to thrive? And if so, what can we do to revive it?
So this is a touchy and sensitive subject because my answer to your second question is yes, it is essential. And especially the first kind of premise of Christianity, belief in one God, is essential. And I think, because I believe that Christianity is true, I ultimately think that all of its creedal propositions are essential. But we could start, I would be happy if we could start by having the conversation about God and whether we need him to make sense of our world and of morality and all the things that we know are necessary and good. And I think that the reason people feel alienated from that tradition, from that idea of God, the best diagnostician of this problem, in my view, is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche comes up in the book. He comes under some fire in the book. So I always feel like I want to give him his due. He is somebody who saw, perhaps more clearly than any of his contemporaries, with the possible exception of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Friedrich Nietzsche saw what it meant to reduce the world to material science. And this famous line, "God is dead and we have killed him," which comes from the gay science, is put into the mouth of a madman raving in the streets. And there's a reason for that. And it's not because God is dead is a crazy thing to say. It's because Nietzsche feels like the guy shouting in the street about what's going on that nobody else can see, even though it's right in front of them, because everybody around him sort of feels like, oh, well, Darwin has given a great account of the world and humanity. We have physics to kind of teach us our place in the universe. And without, we don't need God really to make sense of any of this. We don't need the transcendent. We don't need anything beyond the physical. And we can do that and keep all of our morals. We can keep all of our ethics, right? All of our absolute truths and goodness. And Nietzsche is the only one who's saying, no, no, all of your morals are founded on this one premise, which is that beyond the physical world, undergirding all space and time, there is a divine will and a divine mind, which actually, because without a mind, without a will, there's no such thing as like good or bad. That doesn't live in nature. That doesn't live in the blind mechanistic process of atoms bouncing off each other. That's something that we experience only in the human mind on this earth. And we think that it refers to some final absolute truth because the truths that we discern dimly with our mind, we believe exist in the absolute mind beyond nature. And if you don't believe in that absolute mind, then you've pulled the rug out from under the entire thing and it will all come crashing down. And nobody sees this. They think they can be halfway relativists, halfway atheists, basically. And I think, and on this point at least, Nietzsche has been proven exactly right. There's another portion where he says, your belief that something is right and good is probably very likely just a holdover from what you were taught unthinkingly, and it will endure for only so long before you have to examine the premises and scrap it all entirely. And this is what we're seeing now with things like, for instance, abortion, a controversial topic, I know, but people will say that they believe in human life and the human. Yeah, and the importance, the dignity of humanity, and then gradually chip away at the edges of what it means to be a human being. And why are they doing that? It's because, at base, they've been taught a kind of empty materialist philosophy. And so, yes, we absolutely need some kind of supernatural, some kind of God to make sense of our nation, of our lives together, of just human life. But we have been scared out of it, and we've been intimidated out of it by the kind of thundering pronouncements of scientism, which is the idea that material science explains the whole world. And although I'm a big fan of material science for describing and perceiving the physical world, I think it's really badly ill-equipped to explain the non-physical aspects of us, our dreams, our joys, our desires. And every time it tries, it sort of breaks down into this silliness. And this is why what I argue in the book is that it's not so much that we need to come back to religion. It's that we have to understand that we're already in a cult. We're in a cult called scientism, which tries to find spiritual meaning in non-spiritual things. And this is the meaning, I believe, of the line in the Psalms that the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. It's not that line is not just saying like, oh, atheists are dumb. What that line is saying is if you tell yourself you don't believe in a God, that you're not worshiping something, then you've made yourself a fool. You're kidding yourself. And that's the position we find ourselves in. It's why I think so many people have wandered away from the faith, is because they've sort of self-deluded, much like the people in the streets of Nietzsche's, that Nietzsche's madman was wandering through the street. They've sort of self-deluded into thinking that they can just get by on bare material facts. And instead what they've done is just become blind worshippers of idols, become, unself-aware participants in various political cults, bending the knee at Black Lives Matter rallies in prayer for absolution, trusting capital S the science, and believing in Dr. Fauci as the representative of the science, right, which is a claim to clerical authority. So, in the book, rather than saying I want to shove my religion down your throat or whatever, I'm sure I'll be accused of that nevertheless, and already have been, wanting to sort of impose theocracy like Pope hat intensifies. Like none of that is true. In the book, all I'm saying is you're already worshiping. Everybody is already worshiping, because it's impossible to act as if there isn't some highest good in the world. So become self-aware, do some introspection, and ask what is worthy of your worship. What can you worship that won't enslave you, but will instead set you free? And I will give you a spoiler alert in that journey. It's not Dr. Fauci. It's not the WEF. It's not Davos. And it's not even the mathematical equations that people tell you will solve all political problems. There is actually an answer to this question. It comes from the scriptures. There is one God worthy of worship. And you don't have to become like a Nicene Creed Christian overnight, although, of course, I believe it would be great if you did. I just think, there's there's a better way out there for you to be doing what you're already doing. There's a better way to worship. There's a better person to worship. And you'll be happier if you acknowledge that.
And in a related question, and I ask this occasionally of my guests, is the culture war really at its heart a spiritual war, a spiritual battle?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the culture war is a major feature of the crisis of meaning section of the book, which is very closely linked to the crisis of religion section. And one of the insights that I think the Greeks can bring to this question, especially Plato, and we were just talking about, the exile of the poets from the Republic, but also Aristotle, who kind of modifies Plato, tames him, pulls him back from the edge a little bit, and distills some of his insights in a more moderate way. One of the things we learn is that art is never morally neutral. And I think for a long time, the culture wars were proceeding along these kind of disingenuous or false lines where the right thought that it was arguing for morality in art against the left that thought it was arguing for no morality in art for art's sake, art just kind of detached from any moral judgments. Vladimir Nabokov talked about pure aesthetic bliss. There's no moral, there's no message, whatever. And what we're seeing is that that's really never true. Art always comes along because it's a depiction of the world, because it aims to represent and reproduce reality as we experience it. And because reality has a moral dimension, because we experience the world not simply as facts and figures, but also as moral judgments, that some things are good and bad, absolutely. Art really always contains those premises in it. It contains a certain moral depiction of the world, good or bad. Sometimes it's an honest depiction, sometimes it's a dishonest depiction. And so as we kind of move into the 21st century version of the culture wars, what we're seeing is actually just a battle between two competing moral visions of the world. The conservative moral vision looks recognizable to you and me. It has to do with kind of traditional morality and with American liberty, but also patriotism and also faith and these kind of like core ideas. The lefty idea has to do with total liberation from all constraint, right? You should be able to do anything sexually that you want, but you should not be able to speak ill of certain classes. And so the whole fight for like representation, which is expressed as a moral imperative. You need to have this many women, people of color, like homosexual people, whatever, in your art. That's a moral claim that says art shapes the way people view the world. We want it to shape them in a certain way. So you're in a fight between two competing moral visions, and that's the crisis of meaning. What does art mean, and what is it supposed to mean? What do we want it to mean? And in my view, there is no getting around the spiritual nature of that. When Sam Smith got up at the Grammys and he wore his funny little Satan hat, or when Lil Nas X did his dance in that song "Call Me by Your Name," conservatives freaked out, and rightly so. But I think we're still not freaking out in the right way yet. We haven't learned to articulate this. That it's not that somebody did a funny Satan dance, because then they always say, "Oh, what's it to you? It's all just a silly, tacky dance." And it's like, no, it's because there's a representation here of something which actually is degrading, and that is a depiction of the world as if sex is like a completely spiritless act. It has no connection to the spiritual world, no moral dimension, and it should just be done for a kind of pleasure and maybe even for money, right? And that is a kind of evil position. That is a spiritual fight that we're having. And I think we could have it in an artistically sensitive way that says it's not that we're against portraying sex, it's that we're against lying about sex, lying about the world to people who don't know any better, especially kids. And that is like very much a legitimate spiritual fight to be having. And I do think ultimately that is what the culture war is about.
also write about the crisis of reality. And just for the record, let me just mention what the 5 crises are that you identify. The crisis of reality, the crisis of the body, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of religion, and the crisis of the regime. And I think, by the way, that's kind of a brilliant way to organize or categorize some of the cultural and moral issues that we're facing today. But in any case, you write about the crisis of reality. And one of the problems I think we're facing in our culture is this postmodern notion that there is no objective truth, that there's only my truth and your lived experience and my lived experience. And many people say that reason and rationality themselves are just white concepts and that there are other ways of knowing that are just as valid. Is there such a thing as objective truth?
Yes, is the short answer. Yes, there is. And it's incoherent to claim otherwise. To say that there is no such thing as objective truth is to make an objective truth claim. And so we really have no choice if we want to operate in the world and have conversations, but to believe in this. But at a deeper level, first of all, thank you for your comments about the organization, which I have gotten a lot of questions about that because when you say these are the 5 crises and they go in this order, everybody's like, well, where did you just pick those out of a hat? And it's like, the answer is no. I actually thought very long and hard about how to organize this information. And the reason that reality comes first is it's the conversation you have to have before you talk about anything else. Before it's a very first principle level question that is nevertheless incredibly visible in our politics and in our news cycle. The phrase my truth, the phrase post-truth politics, the phrase virtual reality, all of these ideas are very current and they all raise this same issue. Is there true or false, absolutely, or not? So it has that advantage as a way to kick off the book, but it has another advantage as well, which is it's a perfect example of something that feels incredibly new, but is actually really old. And you think, oh, post-truth politics, the kind of just it depends on what the meaning of is the devolution of all boundaries between true and false. Like this is a very modern sort of post or even postmodern cynicism. But no, actually, it is just the exact same debate that Greek philosophy begins with. Socrates enters into a culture in Athens that is in which it's extremely fashionable to say, as Hamlet would later say, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And not only was it fashionable, it was also convenient because Athens was embarking upon this experiment in direct democracy. And if you could persuade people to do something in the ecclesia, in the council, you could do it. There was almost no limit to what you could vote in or out in Athens at this time. And so the only restraint on that set of the only possible restraint on that set of actions would be some kind of moral framework, some sort of absolute yes or no, thou shalt not. And the way that Athens falls apart is precisely by kind of plunking for relativism, by just saying, justice is the will of the stronger. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And so we're going to take what we want. And this cracks up. It falls apart for the reason that if that's the only thing you have is just people's, truth, is just relativism, all you have left is power politics, is violence and fighting. And this is why Socrates is the great teacher of the fact that there is no halfway relativism. There is no sophisticated, blunt smoking dorm room reflection about how everything is, all truths are relative, man. There's no version of that then allows you to go out into the world and operate as a kind of fine, upstanding citizen. You've destroyed the grounds for doing so, and eventually this will become clear. And I think it's becoming clear in our politics. And it makes it kind of a good moment for saying to people, this has never worked. This doesn't work. It actually leads you into a place that you're not going to like. The society that is built on this idea of relativism is not a society that you want to live in. And so there's only one other way out, and that's the Socrates way, which is the only innovation over this that has ever been thought of before. This is the only kind of alternative. It is actually not old or fusty at all. It's actually one of the great innovations of human thought to say, yes, there is absolute truth. We can progress toward knowledge of it together, and otherwise we're doomed.
Another crisis that you write about is the crisis of the regime, about political systems and democracy and republicanism. One of the things I encounter in some conservatives is a kind of a pessimism, or maybe fatalism is a better way to put it. They look at the culture and our political situation and everything just seems to be going to hell in a handbasket. And they say, well, the American experiment is over. We had a good run. but all civilizations and empires must come to an end, like the Roman Empire did, and this is our time. Can we recover, or are we today's Rome?
Right. Yeah. I'm really glad you asked me about this because I am kind of a constitutional optimist. That is, I always sit around and look at a situation and think, well, how could this could get better? How could this get better? And there are people who are constitutional pessimists who think this is definitely going to go badly. This is going to get worse. And my conviction is that it's really not worth our time to sit around and try to talk each other into or out of pessimism or optimism. You know, if you're a pessimist and I'm an optimist, neither of us is going to come away satisfied from a conversation in which we try to persuade the other of our point of view. And the reason for that is that pessimism and optimism are both predictions about the future. And the thing about the future is we do not know what is going to happen in it. We really do not. And this is good news and bad news because I actually mean we don't know. So in the book, The Crisis of the Regime section, I lay out in, I think, some detail and kind of development what this theory is of that would paint us as the new Rome, the cycle of regimes, anacyclosis, which says, yeah, nations rise and fall, they rise and fall in discernible ways. Ours is very visibly heading in that direction. And there is like a really good case to be made for that. But there's also a good case to be made that that is not a cycle which ever pristinely repeats itself in exactly the same shape. It's not a prescription. It's not a destiny. It's a kind of template for understanding things and for discerning. Once you know where you are on that template, you can at least know what might be done about the decay. So I end up saying, our decay is a form of Republican decay, the decay of a republic, which ends you up in a kind of oligarchy. And the antidote to this is local associations, is philia and the recovery of citizenship as kind of face-to-face engagement. What I personally like about that is it's something to do. And whether you think that it's all going to hell in a handbasket, or whether you think that like there's every reason to be optimistic, doesn't actually change. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to curse God and die? Are you just going to sit around in despair? Like, even if I could prove to you that everything is going to go wrong, I'm not so sure that it would change the way this cashes out, which is we have a job to do. And one last thing about that job, which ultimately is the preservation of the West, right? The carrying forth of the traditions and the beliefs and the ideals of this great civilization. A beautiful thing about understanding yourself that way as an inheritor of this tradition is that it means it doesn't actually depend on what happens in the next election. It's not that it doesn't matter what happens in the next election. It just means that whatever happens in the next election, you have the same job, and that's carrying the light. And, I think all the time in this context about Cicero, the Roman statesman, talk about the fall of Rome, right? This is a guy who lived at the very end of the Roman Republic. And that was a period that looked a lot like ours in a lot of ways, sort of an overexpanded republic that didn't really know how to govern itself at home or abroad, that had lost its concept of citizenship. And Cicero basically felt defeated. He had to back out of public life, and he said, I'm gonna go and create a republic of letters because there's no republic in actual fact, and so I'm just going to write political philosophy and other kinds of philosophy about the ideal. In the short term, in the historical term, Cicero failed utterly. He was one of the first victims of the incoming regime, which was to be an empire. And he may have looked at that and just thought, this all went terribly wrong. On the other hand, if you can bear to fast forward many hundreds of years to the 1770s, in walks John Adams, this curmudgeon who has pored for his life since his boyhood over the works of none other than Marcus Cicero, and who gets up and gives his great speech in defense of the Declaration of Independence, sets this country on the road to its genesis. I mean, if you're dealing with that kind of timescale and with a tradition that lasts and passes down through that many generations, we have no room for despair. We have no right to despair. We have a job, and that is to wake up every day to seek the good, the true, and the beautiful in the city in which we find ourselves, and to trust to God for the future. I mean, this is like, I know that things look very bleak, and I don't want to try to talk anybody out of his pessimism because I don't think that I can. I just want to ask, like, what is the point? I mean, given granted that all your predictions are going to come true, does it change what you're supposed to do? I don't think it does. I think that, the antidote to our problem, if there is one, is civic engagement, is political love and friendship. And if it's going to be a question of those who wish to recover American greatness through face-to-face interaction and those who do not, I know which side I want to be on. I know which side I'm going to try to be on when I wake up tomorrow morning. And that's enough for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. I love your optimism. The final paragraph of your book, for example, is not, I want to give away any spoilers, but it's so hopeful and inspirational and powerful that I wish I'd written it myself. Most people are not in the position of being culture makers. They don't, they don't run movie studios or have a publishing company or run a social media network. They don't want the culture to degenerate or collapse any further, but it's hard to move the needle of the culture unless you are in that kind of position of power. What are some practical steps that the quote-unquote ordinary person can do to deal with the crises we're facing and to maybe, help turn this ocean liner of the culture around?
This is a really important question because when we think about it in terms of what would I do if I were a culture maker or a politician for that matter, it's very easy for despair to set in because most of us, as you say, are not in some position to wave a magic wand or install whatever regime we want. And we have to approach these things at a human-sized level. And what I would say is this: people like you and me who talk for a living, who are out here sort of writing things and trying to forge a path ahead with ideas. We often get called or thought of as leaders, right? Thought leaders. This is a word that often gets applied. In my view, that's not quite right. I think what we are is standard bearers. I think that the people who are going to be in the trenches doing stuff are the people you just talked about who aren't going to make a Hollywood movie, but are going to pick what movie to show their kids. And for that, I would introduce an ancient concept that is really important that doesn't really get talked about a lot, and that is honor. It's from a Latin word, onos, which basically just means something that you attribute to what is good. It's a reward for goodness, and rewarding goodness is part of justice. And so thinking very carefully about what you honor in your household and in your community is a good inroad to taking concrete steps, right? When people say, I don't want to watch Netflix anymore because they're piping garbage into my kids' ears, that's a good impulse. And we could actually seize onto that impulse, all of us, and systematize it and make it real a little bit more and understand that in doing that, what we're really saying is I want my family, at least first and foremost, to be a place where the good is honored, where the kinds of art we consume, the kinds of practices we undertake, the prayers we say before meals, the education, crucially, the education that I give to my children, which is a kind of soul shaping, a soul formation. All of this is going to be oriented toward the good. And we've been talking this whole time about how to seek the good. That's in these texts, it's in this tradition. So you have a handbook right there in front of you for what is good. And you have a sphere of influence, which is your family and then your community. And you can go out into your school board, you can go out to your church, and you can be an advocate for these very things, for honoring what is good. And it doesn't mean scolding people for doing bad stuff. It actually means celebrating and lifting up the kinds of cultural content and the kinds of cultural practice that are going to be healthy and ennobling and inspiring. So it's one part of this is, and I'm genuinely not log rolling here, I'm saying one part of this is supporting creators that you think are doing something good and meaningful. But the other part of it is genuinely appreciating and handing on to your kids the best of the culture, which includes these great works and includes education. This is I think that's key, and I think we shouldn't undervalue that. I actually think it's the whole game is honoring what is good and teaching kids how to love what is good.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think that's a great note to end on. Listeners, the book is How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises by Spencer Klavan. He may be a classicist, but this is a book for our time. Absolutely. You must read it. Spencer, are you going to keep up the Young Heretics podcast?
Oh, thanks for asking. We are actually moving over. I am moving over to the Daily Wire. I'm really excited about it. It's basically a deeper dive version of what I was doing on Young Heretics. It's the Western world, the Western canon, but in kind of big documentary format. And so people who subscribe to Daily Wire Plus will get, let's say, for instance, Paul's sermon on the Areopagus, which I really believe is like the genesis of the West in some way, because it's when Athens meets Jerusalem. And just, a long form deep dive into why that moment matters so much for us now. And that's going to be kind of starting this year. I'm incredibly excited about it. People can get it on Daily Wire Plus. That's my podcast for the year and years to come.
Fantastic. What is the best way that people can keep up with you?
For my sins, they can find me on Twitter. I'm at Spencer Klavan, which is just my name. And then the book is everywhere. If you are listening to this and you like to listen to stuff, I did read the audiobook. It's on Audible, so you can get it there or wherever audiobooks are sold. But it's also on Amazon and so on and so forth.
Spencer Klavan,